At 7:34 in the morning, everything changed. Millions of people across Colombia suddenly felt the ground move beneath them. And the scary part wasn't just the number. The earthquake measured 7.4. That's powerful on its own. But the epicenter was deep underground, near San Jose del Palmar, in the Chocó region, roughly 250 miles west of Bogotá. So the obvious question is this: how could an earthquake that deep still shake such a huge part of the country? Because this wasn't something people felt in just one small town. The shaking spread fast. People in Bogotá felt it. So did residents in Cali and Medellín. Car alarms started going off. Buildings shook. People rushed outside, not knowing if the next few seconds would make things worse. And the tremor didn't stop at Colombia's borders. It was also felt in parts of Ecuador and Venezuela. That gives you an idea of just how much energy was released underground. According to the reports at the time, this was the strongest earthquake Colombia had experienced in more than a decade. But numbers alone don't really tell you what that means. You have to look at what people were seeing on the ground. In some places, it was fear and confusion. In others, it became something much worse. Buildings were damaged. Communities closer to the western part of the country were hit harder. And in Pereira, the situation quickly turned into a major rescue operation. That's where this story becomes much more than a 7.4 on a seismic scale. Because the earthquake didn't have to happen directly underneath a city to tear lives apart. And Pereira was about to show just how serious the damage could get. Nearly 60 miles underground. That sounds deep. Deep enough that you might think the worst of the shaking would stay close to the epicenter. But that's not what happened. The U.S. Geological Survey estimated the quake started somewhere between 60 and 100 kilometers below the surface. Colombia's Geological Service put it at around 96 kilometers. So, here's the question people naturally ask. If the earthquake started that far below ground, why did cities hundreds of miles away still shake so hard? Because the energy didn't stay in one place. It traveled. And it traveled across a huge part of the country. Bogotá felt it. Cali felt it. Medellín felt it. The shaking was strong enough to send people running out of buildings and into the streets. And it didn't stop at Colombia's borders. People in parts of Ecuador and Venezuela felt the tremor too. That's what makes this earthquake so unsettling. The epicenter may have been deep, but the impact was wide. Experts estimated that more than 2 million people were exposed to very strong shaking. Still, the damage wasn't spread evenly. Western and central Colombia took the hardest hit. That's where the shaking stopped being just frightening and started becoming destructive. And as reports came in from the coffee-growing region, one city quickly stood out: Pereira. What happened there showed just how dangerous this earthquake had become. Pereira was where the scale of this disaster really started to sink in. The city sits in Colombia's Risaralda department, right in the country's coffee-growing region. When the shaking hit, it wasn't just something people felt under their feet. Buildings were badly damaged. Some came down. People rushed into the streets, scared and confused, while emergency crews tried to figure out where help was needed most. And then the first reports of deaths started coming in. According to local officials at the time, at least 18 people were confirmed dead in Pereira alone, but that number only told part of the story. Behind every damaged building was the same urgent question: was someone still inside? Rescue crews began working through the destruction, searching damaged and collapsed structures while families waited for news. And nobody really knew how bad it was yet. That uncertainty made everything worse. Because after a major earthquake, the first reports are rarely the full picture. Some neighborhoods can be reached quickly. Others can't. Communications go down. Roads can become difficult to use. It takes time before anyone understands the real scale of what happened. Then reports started coming in from Manizales, in the neighboring Caldas department. At least 2 more deaths were reported there. But one image made the force of the earthquake impossible to ignore. The tower of the city's historic cathedral collapsed. A structure that had stood over the city was suddenly coming apart. You didn't need a seismic chart to understand what that meant. You could see the power of the earthquake with your own eyes. And Pereira wasn't the whole story. As more information came in from other cities and towns, it became clear that Colombia wasn't dealing with one badly damaged city. This was spreading across an entire region. Deaths and injuries were being reported in more communities. Buildings had collapsed, people were still trapped, and rescue teams were only beginning to understand how much ground they had to cover. The next reports coming out of Cali and the communities closer to the epicenter would make the situation even more serious. Then came the reports from Cali. This is Colombia's third largest city, home to around 2 million people. A place that big is supposed to feel far removed from a small mountain town near the epicenter. But that morning, the distance didn't matter much. According to the city's mayor, people were trapped inside at least 19 collapsed buildings. That changed everything. Now, this wasn't just about measuring damage. It was a race against time. Rescue crews moved into the rubble, searching for survivors, while families waited nearby, hoping someone they loved would be pulled out alive. Witnesses described huge clouds of dust rising over the city as structures came down. And every collapsed building brought the same question. Is someone still inside? But while Cali was dealing with destruction on the scale of a major city, the communities closer to the epicenter had a different problem. Getting help there wasn't easy. San Jose del Palmar has only around 4,800 residents. It's a small town surrounded by mountainous terrain in Choco, and it was very close to where the earthquake began. The shaking there was intense. Buildings were damaged, people were injured, but officials still didn't have a complete picture of what had happened. Some communities were simply harder to reach. That matters after a disaster like this. In a city, rescue teams may have more roads, hospitals, equipment, and people nearby. In a remote mountain community, every damaged road and every communication problem can cost precious time. Nearby, Novita was already feeling that pressure. The local health center became overwhelmed as injured residents arrived looking for treatment. The town's church and other buildings had also suffered serious damage. So now Colombia was facing two very different rescue situations at the same time. A major city with people trapped beneath collapsed buildings, and small mountain communities where even reaching the injured could be difficult. Different places, different problems. But the question was exactly the same. Who was still waiting for help, and could rescuers reach them in time? Because another danger was already hanging over every damaged building. The ground could start shaking again, and it did. The main earthquake was over, but the danger wasn't. Aftershocks started hitting the region, including tremors measuring 2.8 and 5. On paper, those numbers sound much smaller than 7.4, but after a major earthquake, that doesn't mean they're harmless. Some buildings were already cracked. Others had suffered serious structural damage. A building can survive the first big shake and still be dangerously weak afterward. That's what made every aftershock so worrying. For rescue crews working around damaged buildings, another sudden jolt could turn an already dangerous situation into something much worse. And for residents, there was another difficult decision. Do you go back inside? Your clothes are there. Your money, documents, medicine, family photos, everything you use every day. But emergency officials were warning people not to enter damaged buildings until they had been inspected. Because standing doesn't always mean safe. Sometimes the damage you can't see is the part you should worry about most. At the same time, hospitals in the hardest-hit areas were coming under pressure. More injured people were arriving for treatment. Some medical centers were already stretched thin, and families who could no longer safely return home needed somewhere to stay. So even after the ground became quiet, the emergency kept growing. Rescue teams still had people to find. Doctors still had patients coming through the doors. Families were still waiting for news, and officials were still trying to reach isolated communities and understand the full extent of the damage. That's one of the hardest realities after a major earthquake. The shaking may last seconds. The consequences can last much longer. And just because a building is still standing doesn't mean the danger has passed. For Colombia, that morning was no longer just about surviving one massive earthquake. It was about surviving what came next. So, why is Colombia exposed to earthquakes like this in the first place? A big part of the answer comes down to location. Colombia sits along the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's a huge zone around the Pacific Ocean, where tectonic plates are constantly interacting beneath the surface. and it's responsible for a large share of the world's earthquakes and volcanic activity. For Colombia, that means earthquakes aren't some distant possibility. The risk is always there. You can't stop tectonic plates from moving. You can't prevent an earthquake from starting miles underground. And you can't know exactly when the next major one will hit. But that doesn't mean nothing can be done. Because the magnitude of an earthquake is only part of the story. What happens above ground matters just as much. How strong are the buildings? How quickly can emergency crews respond? Can hospitals handle a sudden wave of injured people? Can rescuers reach remote communities when roads or communications are damaged? And do people know what to do in those first confusing minutes? Those questions can make a huge difference when the ground starts moving. That's the painful lesson from disasters like this. The earthquake itself may be unavoidable. A catastrophe on the same scale isn't always inevitable. Preparation matters. Building safety matters. Emergency response matters. And what happens in the first minutes and hours can determine what happens next. For the families affected across Colombia, though, those lessons come at a terrible price. Rescue crews still have damaged buildings to search. Hospitals still have people to treat. And some families are still waiting for answers. The shaking may have stopped, but for the communities living through the aftermath, this disaster is far from over.